Welcome to this Royal Irish Academy webinar on the cultural consequences of COVID, understanding the pandemic. My name is Daniel Carey, and I am the Academy's Secretary for Humanities and Social Sciences. I'm also Director of the Moore Institute at NUIG Galway, and we're running this event in partnership. This session is actually the 10th in a webinar series that we've done in the Academy on COVID-19 called Perspectives and Pathways in a Time of Crisis. There are recordings of our previous events available on YouTube, and we've had well over 10,000 views, so great to see that level of response to the series. I just thought I'd say a word or two about today's event before turning to our speakers and introducing them. The pandemic, as we know, is not over. In fact, COVID rates are rising in Ireland as they are in many different places. At the same time, we're starting to reflect in particular ways on the consequences, if you like, of the pandemic. They are cultural consequences, and that's what we're trying to here to think about today in a number of its aspects. This is also an opportunity to think about the contribution that the humanities make to our ability to understand this crisis and event. Sometimes I think that's underestimated. Naturally, we turn to vaccines and as a remedy for this particular dilemma, not just in Ireland, but globally, of course. But also, it's an opportunity to reflect on social values, social implications, and these kind of consequences, if you like. So I think it's an opportunity today to reflect on that more fully. I'm really delighted to be able to welcome Professor Sarah Heinz of the University of Vienna and Professor Diane Negra of University College Dublin, who are our speakers today. Sarah is full professor of English and Anglophone literatures at the University of Vienna, and she's the author of a monograph on A.S. Byatt and the editor of a collection of essays on subject cultures, the English novel from the 18th to the 21st century. She's currently a visiting research fellow in the Moore Institute at NUIG Galway. She previously taught in the universities of Passau, Mannheim, and at Humboldt University Berlin, and was a visiting scholar at the University of Michigan. Diane Negra is Professor of Film Studies and Screen Culture at University College Dublin, and she's the author, editor, or co-editor of 13 books, and she's currently at work on a book under the title, In Order to Serve You Better, Affect, Authority, and Antagonism in the New Cultures of Customer Service. And her previous publications include books such as Gendering the Recession, Media and Culture in an Age of Austerity, and What a Girl Wants, Fantasizing the Reclamation of Self in Post-Feminism. Just a word before we begin, I wanted to thank Jennifer Keneally and the Royal Irish Academy and Jennifer Riley. They're both helping us run the series as they have throughout the pandemic. They'll be running things behind the scenes. We've had 75 people sign up today. Very grateful for your interest in this. We'll start with talks by our two speakers, and then we'll turn to questions, and you can use the chat for that function. So please do, and we'll get to as many of them as we can. So Sarah, I wonder if I could invite you to start.
Yes, thank you, Dan. I'll share my screen with you in a second. Okay, I hope you can see it. Okay, so first of all, a thank you to Dan for organizing this, and a big thank you to the Royal Irish Academy for hosting this, and a big thank you to the Moore Institute, who is hosting my visiting research stay in Galway, which is sadly coming to an end soon, but I have enjoyed myself immensely. So I'm presenting to you an ongoing project about lockdown novels and the politics of home under COVID-19. And I would like to start with a short introduction to ideas and associations with home. In recent years, I have taught a number of seminars, lectures, and workshops, summer schools on home across different national and international contexts. And what I always start with is to ask the participants what they associate with the word home. Reactions used to be surprisingly consistent. For the majority of people, home is safety, comfort, and a private space. Home also is community and family, and it is connected to their sense of selfhood and agency. It is a space where they can be themselves, or as one participant from Vienna phrased it, home is where the dog licks my face. These associations show that home is an erratic term. It glows, it promises something, and it connects us with our past and the people we love. However, this glowy sense of home as a private sanctuary abruptly changed for many people during the lockdowns imposed due to COVID-19. People were forced, often under threat of police penalties, to remain in their private homes, an experience that made many reevaluate this seemingly familiar space. Instead of a cozy space of retreat, home became associated with tedium and dullness at best, or isolation and imprisonment at worst. It became obvious for many people that home is not their private refuge, and that it can be a site of negative feelings, harmful experiences, and a space where social disparities play out. The research project I want to present here takes this reassessment of home as its cue. In the project, I proceed from the assumption that the pandemic laid bare that home is never neutral, private, or simply ours. It is where inside and outside and private and public intersect in a politics of home. And it is this politics of home and its connection to ideas about individual agency, family, community, and the nation state that the project explores. Proceeding from interdisciplinary research on home, the project looks at narrative representations of people and societies in lockdown, and it introduces the term of the lockdown novel as a longer narrative text dealing with the effects of lockdown regulations and practices. What I assume is that the lockdown novels under analysis think out and through the idea of home as our space of safety and agency, as well as our space of confinement and external control. With the first English language lockdown novels being published since 2020, this is very much an ongoing project with an emerging corpus of text. And for my presentation today, I will use Peter May's thriller Lockdown, published in April 2020, which is allegedly the first novel about the COVID-19 pandemic in English. My close reading of this text will illustrate that the novel fosters a sense of home as a space of imprisonment and control by showing a society confined to their homes. This awareness uncovers ideals of a bounded private home as a construction, and it questions positive associations of home as warmth, belonging, and safety. In the presentation itself, I will proceed in 3 steps. First, I will sketch how we can conceptually make sense of the reassessment of home during lockdown. And in the light of this reassessment, I will then provide a short close reading of Peter May's thriller Lockdown, and I will give you a short sense of the corpus of text that the project deals with. And finally, I will close with a short conclusion. So I would like to start my short conceptual sketch by asking what home is in the first place. In spite of the intuitive easiness with which most people approach the idea of home, it is notoriously tricky to define as soon as you look closer. Home is a multidimensional term that may refer to physical structures, social units, a place of origins, concrete practices, or affective ties. It is a place, a performance, a feeling, or a sense of self, all at the same time. However, what most associations share is their seeming stability and boundedness, and their sense of home as a place of belonging or even becoming. Morley describes such an understanding of home as part of a sedentary discourse that focuses on being there, on staying, rather than on movement. This stability of home as a place of staying is usually assessed as positive, because the boundedness of home offers safety, privacy, and even coziness. This often takes the metaphoric form of home as warmth. As Amy, one of the central protagonists of Peter May's Lockdown, remembers, before the pandemic, she used to think of her home as a warm, bounded space to which she could always return after being outside. And this is a quote from the novel. Cold days, when you wanted to be out walking, striding out with the wind in your face, the cold sting of rain on your cheeks, hurrying home for a bowl of hot soup, curtains drawn against the night, curled up on the settee with a good book and a glass of soft red wine. The phrase curled up on the settee echoes Bachelard's notion of home as the place to curl up comfortably. This evokes phenomenological approaches to home as a site and an experience that integrates one's life into an existential whole. However, for the staying to be assessed as positive and integrative, we need the sense that we can leave and return. With the inability to come and go as she pleases, Amy's sense of home has changed. She reflects, And here she was, huddled bleakly in her wheelchair, cold and depressed, and letting dark thoughts creep in to cloud her usual sunny disposition. Warmth turns into cold, the comfy curling up on the sofa turns into being huddled in a wheelchair. Lockdown had this effect for many people. But in the project, I want to take the analysis of this effect one step further. Building on existing critiques of idealizations of home, I analyze the lockdown experience not as a mere short-term interruption of cozy experiences of home. Rather, I discuss how experiences of dwelling cannot be separated from social structures and often discriminatory institutions that make and shape our experiences of home. Lockdown did not simply interrupt the normal comfort of our homes. It rather explicated already existing norms and power relations within the home through their denormalization. Most, if not all, the practices within the home are highly regulated and acquired within contexts that tell us how to properly do home within our culture and family. Yet this process of learning mostly remains hidden. Home arrangements are thus sites upon which ideas and ideals of a community are acted out in the most mundane practices and relations. This is the politics of home that I want to explore in the project. Lockdown made obvious that home is and was open to public interference even before the pandemic. And it made explicit many of the implicit cultural assumptions about home that we used to take for granted. In a sense, the closure of home showed its openness to intervention and power structures. But how can the corpus that I call lockdown novels help us to make sense of this openness? In the following, I will sketch the overall project corpus and give you a very short close reading of Peter May's thriller Lockdown, specifically its beginning and end. I define the term lockdown novel as longer fiction narratives about lockdown, the protagonist's lockdown experiences, and the impact that a pandemic event affecting these lockdowns has on the communities and societies represented in the story. From this larger body of texts, only those lockdown novels are chosen which explicitly focus on changing homemaking practices, relations, and emotions towards home during and after lockdown. Up to now, more than 15 novels dealing with lockdown across a number of genres have been published in English. These lockdown novels are analyzed together because they share cultural ideas and ideals of what a homely home is. And they also share the white, heteronormative, and middle-class inflection of house as home and home as property. As a consequence, these lockdown novels engage with home and staying at home in strikingly similar ways, emphasizing home as both a place of violence, isolation, or imprisonment, but also a potential place of shelter or haven, where people, families, and communities can rebuild the ties destroyed by a pandemic. Peter May's thriller Lockdown is a good example for the earliest wave of cultural production that dealt with the COVID lockdowns when they were first imposed. The novel is set in London under strict curfew and was originally written in 2005 during the bird flu epidemic. Publishers had rejected the novel then because they found it unrealistic, saying that, quote, "this could never happen." Telling his publisher about it in 2020, May reports that, quote, "my editor just about fell out of his chair. He read the entire book overnight, and the next morning he said, 'This is brilliant. We need to publish this now.'" To give you a sense of how May's thriller explicates the violent politics of home unearthed by lockdown, I will shortly trace how interior spaces are presented in the novel, concentrating on how threatening home spaces become. Lockdown begins with a prologue narrated from the perspective of a female protagonist, a little girl who is first unnamed. The short chapter is told in the present tense and printed in italics, which separates it from the rest of the novel. With this prologue, the thriller begins in medias res and with a murder that will set off the plot of the rest of the novel. And this is the very first sentence. Her scream echoes through the dark, squeezed through a throat constricted by fear. Right in this first sentence, the novel uses images of darkness and confinement experienced in the body of the victim. These images are then expanded to describe the house as a body, when the narrator muses upon the fact that no one will hear her scream. But the thick walls of this old house wrap themselves around the horror of the night to ensure that the only ears to hear her are deaf to her plight. The motif of being wrapped up does not conjure up the coziness of a blanket used to curl up on the couch. It rather expresses that the girl cannot get help because she cannot get out, and the house is cold and frightening. On the other hand, inanimate objects like the walls or the cold air take on an uncanny agency. The cold, damp air wraps itself around her. The rest of the prologue gives the reader a detailed tour of the house, describing rooms, carpets, the stained glass window of the front door, or the stairwell. This tour, however, is not a pleasurable journey through a cozy family home, but the girl's frantic flight from her killer, and the sentence, "there is no way out," is repeated twice. She's finally apprehended in the bomb shelter that the former residents built during World War II, yet another emergency in which people had to look for safety that their homes could not provide. This scene again inverts positive associations with home, this time through family relations and the use of terms of endearment. Quote, "The handle turns, and she presses herself back against the wall as slowly the door opens. He crouches slowly and reaches a hand towards her. She cannot see his face, but she can hear him smile. 'Come to daddy,' he says softly." This ending of the prologue, with this gesture of reaching out towards the child and the emphasis on the slowness and softness of the killer approaching, turns positive associations with home and family upside down. The parent is the ultimate danger, and the family home is a prison and a slaughterhouse. The novel thus makes new sense of Elizabeth George's famous definition of home as the place where one is in because another is kept out. And we could rephrase this as home is the place where one is in because you cannot get out. The one protagonist who ultimately is most comfortably at home in Peter May's novel is the virus. Accordingly, it is the virus's agency that ends the novel in a thrilling final scene set at London's familiar tourist site, the London Eye. And this is the final sentence of the novel. In the distance, the first glimmer of light in the winter sky reflected all the way upriver from the east, and McNeil, who's the investigating officer, and McNeil felt the first tickle at the back of his nose and the first roughness at the back of his throat. So I now want to draw a short conclusion to my presentation. Home is a contested concept, but for most people, it used to be stable, bounded, and mostly positive, a place of warmth. This positive sense of home can be reassessed due to experiences of lockdown. Being confined to home, having to stay rather than being able to stay, brings out the problematic sides of home, its unhomeliness, as well as its openness to public intervention and power relations. Peter May's thriller and the corpus of text that I term lockdown novels do not simply use this scenario as a background for their stories, but rather work through the unhomeliness of home spaces in order to show that human agency, the freedom to move, and the privacy and safety of our houses and bodies is fragile and open to interventions. Home is always already a product of power politics. It is a field of rules, and lockdown enables an explication of these otherwise hidden and normalized rules. So thanks a lot for your attention, and I'm looking forward to your questions.
Thank you very much, Sarah. That was terrific. What such an interesting analysis of the meanings and significances and cultural construction of the home as a space. I have so many different questions and thoughts to ask you about, and I'm sure others will do too. What we're going to do is have Diane's talk, and then we'll kind of join them together in the conversation part of the session today. So Diane, if I could turn to you.
Sure, thank you, Dan. I want to thank Dan Carey, of course, and also the Royal Irish Academy and the Moore Institute for extending the opportunity to talk alongside Sarah today. And as Dan mentioned, this is a bit of a slice of a new project for me that I'm just starting to really get to grips with, and hopefully we'll have a lot more to say on in the months to come. This project is looking chiefly, although not exclusively, at the US, but what I'm going to try to do today.
Diane's connection is a little bit unstable. We lost you there for a moment, but
you have me back?
Yep, we'll have you back.
Okay. All right, as I was saying, I'm trying to highlight some of the Irish features of the customer service crisis that I think is ongoing. And some of these, I won't have time, of course, this morning just to touch on all of them, but just to say that I think they include things like the proliferation of secondary authentication protocols, work intensification, the hospitality that's shown, particularly in Ireland, to big tech, and its data centers, which of course now jeopardizes power supply to ordinary customers in Ireland, the increasingly common custom of cash refusal in a variety of businesses, the normalization of extraordinary wait times, and as I will talk about a little bit shortly, you can reach Bord Gáis if you don't have a smartphone, but it won't be easy. And also, of course, the signs of collapse in service provision in the taxi industry in Dublin in recent weeks, and of course, most notably at Dublin Airport. So I'll turn now to some more formal remarks and begin. The contemporary consumer economy is marked by failure rates, deep devotion to Byzantine bureaucratic procedures, and the conspicuous constant valuing of high status customers over low status ones. Current affective culture is thus notable for the conversion of customer service encounters to transactions routinely characterized by frustration, impotence, and fury. In this project, I'm considering how what I call the antagonistic interface arises as a function of the way we so often identify with the interests of capital and technology. The concept of the customer is being redefined with work at its center. And this development is sometimes misattributed to the effects of the COVID-19 pandemic. Certainly, the pandemic has rapidly fueled protocol alterations in customer service that discriminate ever more against non-smartphone users, non-frequent flyers, non-preferred customers, etc. A key element of COVID disaster capitalism is customer subordination to technologized systems and the shocking exclusion of older people from access to, for instance, grocery delivery time slots and vaccine appointments has Cathy O'Neill's words, "The privileged are processed more by people, the masses by machines," was very much underway prior to the pandemic. I see the antagonistic interface as a scene of encounter between two exploited figures, customer and worker. And these two are engaged in a proxy conflict that shields corporate power and safeguards the interests of capital. My project is fundamentally rooted in a cultural studies orientation toward analyzing the exercise of power in seemingly banal everyday settings and exchanges. One of its key goals is to explore a set of affective responses to current political and economic conditions that are being channeled through forms of hyper-rationalized customer service. Amidst the complex sociality of commerce and its increasingly combative micro-relations, I also analyze the proliferation of command-based corporate structures and performed affects, arguing that antagonistic tone is partly set by new vocabularies and speech styles. Accordingly, my analysis of the downstream social effects of technologization and profit concentration considers developments such as freely chosen by consumers. So in this project, I'm mapping the complex emotional terrain where frontline workers and customers encounter one another and the ethos of mutual disadvantage, precarity, and vexation that often prevails, even though its mutuality is seldom recognized. Amidst the complex sociality of commerce and its increasingly combative micro-relations, I'm turning to these kind of command-based corporate structures and performed affects, as I say, arguing that antagonistic tone is partly set by these new vocabularies and speech styles. A directive mode of communication now prevails, marked by phraseology like "what I need you to do is," and the slightly warmer "go ahead" end to prompt customers to undertake work on a company's behalf. And this lexicon, I think, bespeaks the confidence of monopolistic and oligopolistic corporate power more and more. So for instance, if you book an event with Eventbrite, you're going to receive a confirming email from Eventbrite that directs you, the ticket holder, to get excited. And then a more kind of relevant example, maybe in the Irish context, digital tasks that they expect you to undertake prior to your trip. But the slogan that comes along with this, and I can see that my internet connection is unstable. Can you hear me, Dan?
We can, yeah,
Okay.
occasionally we interruptions, but they're actually not too bad. So don't worry.
Okay.
Yeah.
So Aer Lingus uses the slogan, "Let's get you organized," in this kind of email. Again, there has to be a sort of, an upbeat sort of tone to the style of communication. And Jennifer, if you could now put up that Bank of Ireland image for me, I want to talk about that for just a second or two. I think you can share the screen. Right. So another example of this in the Irish context, this kind of way in which I think that we can talk about the degradation of customer and user experience, can be seen in Bank of Ireland's high-profile advertising campaign Begin, and you see the image of that here. This is really notable for my purposes in the way that it does this kind of rhetoricization on a grand scale. This image is rather small. Some of them are quite a lot bigger, but Begin is in fact a threat, signaling a new regime of customer deprivation in which branches close, service see here in this image presents these new terms of service as a kind of a joint undertaking, inscribing reciprocity and collaboration onto what is one-sided and mandatory. I think they're out celebrating the solstice with all the time that they've saved doing electronic banking. I'm not really sure what the premise is here, but again, there's a kind of a register of visual grandiosity in these ads by Bank of Ireland. So Jennifer, if you would put up the Aer Lingus image, I'd like to talk about that as well, if you don't mind. That's the one for the BIA pre-order meal service.
Can you see that on your end? I can see that on mine.
I can't see it, but I'm hoping others can.
It's still the Bank of Ireland image there, Jennifer. Yeah, I don't know if you need to take that one down first or.
Yeah, probably. There is, I think it's coming. Let's see.
Yeah.
There it is. Thank you so
Brilliant,
much.
thanks.
Thanks. And then another example that has come across my radar recently, and possibly those of others as well, to a recent boarding pass I received from Aer Lingus. This is offering flyers the opportunity to pre-order rather attractive looking meals. This kind of offer is made much more attractive, as recent flyers will know, because of the practice of insufficient catering, right, where catering usually runs out somewhere around the middle of the plane. But even more notable for my purposes, above the image of the lovely chicken and green beans there is the admonition that travel will be refused if you arrive late at the gate, right? So it's this kind of carrot and stick that I think is very discursively typical of the new customer service environment. And we can take that image down. I just wanted to briefly reference it. Thank you, Jennifer. So amidst the hyping of analog inconvenience and the cultivation of mistrust of the material realm, which is of course evident in things like cash refusal, in this project, I'm also considering how interactions with staff have been reconceived, first as contact, as in contactless payments, and then more recently as friction, as in frictionless shopping of the sort being rolled out in retail environments by Amazon, when the work of staff is negatively inscribed with workers, we are, of course, more likely to be amenable to doing this work ourselves and to having it be invisibilized in all sorts of ways. And I really think Dublin is at a key point in this regard, with the pandemic clearly being leveraged toward cash refusal and the removal of service in various ways. Changes, I think, of this kind are really starting to color the retail environments that are in ways that are favorable to, for example, the euphemistically named practice of dynamic pricing, in which prices are pegged to consumer data. And of course, they're wildly unstable and fluctuating. And these changes are key to what someone like Joe Turo identifies as the discrimination-centered world that's now evolving in retailing. So I'm really arguing across this project that contrary to the idea that technologization endlessly facilitates and even elevates social experience, in fact, it often degrades and coarsens, tightening the chokehold of corporate power and furthering the toxification of our civic life. I'm analyzing the new customer service as a seemingly banal but ultimately trenchant expression of the social cruelty rise of a mode of 21st century work that is as empowering for capital as it is paralyzing for workers. And I'm hoping that you still have me connected.
Yep.
Okay. I'm historicizing these developments in relation to histories of shopping and self-service, and I'm drawing on analyses of call center labor as well. I'm also intending to survey the consumer tech surveillance state and the punishments meted out to the digitally recalcitrant. One of my starting points is a sense that the growing academic literature on labor is incomplete so long as it neglects to recognize how customers themselves are increasingly cast as workers. So in the 21st century service kind of ethos, many new customer obligations are being pitched as desired conveniences. Others are more nakedly opportunistic and even predatory, encompassing a significant range, including the requirement that customers now set up their own cable, for example, or spend time undertaking numerous secondary identification measures in order to use email or internet banking. In my analyses, I'm showing how sweeping and rather rapid shifts in the civilities example, the idea that a customer, upon paying for goods in a shop, should be told the price and also the amount of any change received is so rare these days as to be considered quaint. So if, as we hope, Ireland is coming out of the pandemic, it's striking that in reflecting back, we're sort of seeing an increase in a turn toward favorable assessments of the national COVID performance. This congratulatory discourse, and I'm not assessing whether it is justified or not, jars with the developments of the kind I've been discussing here, which concentrate on an increase of the shadow kind of work that we do as customers of corporations. And as I've alluded to already, the degradation of customer and user experience. I think it's important to notice that these are antisocial and anti-democratic developments. Any hope that may exist to reverse this state of affairs will entail the defetishization of markets, the manifestation of a collective will to push back against techno-bureaucratic coercions, and the rescripting of public life according to notions of care that are socially sourced, not profit-driven. Hopefully I haven't been dropped.
It was just a little bit there at the end. So
Okay.
I didn't know
I'm
if you
so
had-
sorry.
That's all right. I didn't know if you had concluded there, or
I think I had.
it seemed like you were almost arriving at that moment. So thank you very much, Diane. No, we got through just fine. It was just a little bit of, short intervals, but we managed.
Bit of a high wire act. I'm sorry for that. The problems are all on this end.
That's okay. That's okay. And I probably should explain that you're in New York at the moment, so hence the reference to the morning. So rather than
yes.
being utterly dislocated temporality in COVID that's a subject for another seminar, but nonetheless, it's, there's a reason why you were making that reference. So
yes.
Lots of questions and things. Thank you for that terrific talk. It's really concentrated my understanding of a series of these kind of impulses, all that come from different directions, but which are hard to assimilate and to organize in terms of understanding one's relationship to the world, or how that is being scripted, I guess, in a certain kind of way. So yeah, I'm going to start off with some questions. Obviously, very happy to have our audience chip in with things in the chat or otherwise. But yeah, maybe if I could actually, Sarah, I might turn to you in the first instance. One of the features of the pandemic is obviously precisely what you're drawing attention to is lockdown and its logics, and then emerging from lockdown, going back into lockdown again, part of the experience. But I wonder if you could talk about something about the differential experience of people living alone as opposed to people living in family situations. Again, it's all about these disparities of experience, some of which magnified the difficulty in some cases, and not necessarily because people were living together. But I don't know, Sarah, if you wanted to comment on that.
Yeah, surely lockdown per se doesn't exist. And also being locked down in your home space per se does not exist, because it's what lockdown has definitely shown, and what I'm interested in terms of the, the politics of home in the project, is that not everybody basically had a comfortable home to stay in the first place, and that not for everyone it was possible, for example, to have a desk for homeschooling, or even a computer for every child for homeschooling. And the same holds true for people living alone, or people living with their family. How many people are living in the space that you call home? Is it crowded already, and you were basically depending on being able to get outside or to send your kids outside? I mean, many studies on lockdown have focused on homemaking practices, like baking sourdough bread. I mean, everybody got their sourdough starters during lockdown, basically, or gardening. But you basically need a kitchen and a garden to do that in the first place. So that sense of social disparities and differences in living arrangements are basically so fascinating to trace through lockdown, because it shows that people being locked down with their family felt very different senses of being stressed than people who lived alone and who felt increasingly isolated. But also, what about people living alone who had access to the internet and to Zoom? One person in the Q&A posted, Zoom was basically a kind of umbilical cord to the outside world. But what if you didn't have access to Zoom or the internet? This is what I find so fascinating, that home is the place where all that happens, but in very different ways, in very different living arrangements. But what all of these share is that they're impacted by very specific power politics, which take concrete different shapes in different national context, different class context, different family arrangements. Whom do you call family in the first place? But what about cohabitation? How do you define that? When it came to police regulations, people said, you can be inside your home with people that you're cohabiting with. People interpreted this quite differently in different places. I think home is a kind of lens through which you can make sense of how people deal with power relations, but also how power relations impact these different living arrangements.
Yeah, it's an interesting point you make there too about, differential experiences within countries. So I was thinking partly of continental Europe, where there's a lot of high density living in apartment blocks. And that may well be true in Vienna as well, but that's rather different, particularly if in France, where you couldn't leave after 6 p.m., like you had to go back into your space. And Spain, really pretty intensive lockdown experiences. I mean, I'm not commenting on the public health logic of that, but the actual lived experience of it is very different to somebody who does, as you say, have a garden, some space, some refuge, whether it's the front garden, the back, or somewhere, which offered you you could differentiate between simply being in a tightly organized space, presumably with limited, square meters, shall we say.
Yeah, exactly. And you could see that while doing online teaching at university. You could see, all of these students, 32 Zoom tiles, and everybody sitting, some sitting outside because they had moved back in with their parents, others sitting in cramped shared kitchens with, unwashed plates piling up in the background, others, sitting in a kind of space where someone else was putting up washing in the background, it gave a strange sense of access to the private sphere of people, but it also showed that home is not it's not that private in the first place. It's not our place, and there is a very interesting novel by Sarah Moss, which is called The Fell, which is about a mother who needs to get out of the apartment and who leaves her son, but then she has an accident and she can't come back in. So you feel that sense of real threat, which these novels really make sense of. And it's interesting how they have been received, because people, specifically, thrillers like Peter May's, people were actually reading this while locked down. You were sitting in your lockdown apartment, reading a thriller about a serial killer, killing people in their homes during lockdown, and the virus as a kind of second invisible serial killer. And it all ends with the investigating officer obviously having caught the virus, and it kills everyone. So it has that, the reading, the reception situation has a weird timeliness when these novels are published and read during the event that is being addressed.
I suppose it makes one think a little bit also of the Aristotelian unities, because from an aesthetic point of view, yeah, you have unity of place, certainly conferred upon us by lockdown, and unity of time in many respects as well. I mean, do you think, is that a kind of aesthetic dimension of these works that they play off of, possibly in a Gothic vein, not necessarily one which is improving, so to speak?
I mean, for lockdown thrillers, there are at least 5 lockdown thrillers already, only within that genre, and they definitely play with temporality and spatiality. And some even go backwards, or some even count up. And there's the Irish lockdown thriller, it's called 56 Days, and the blurb is locked down together, counting down to murder. And it's at day 1, day 2, day 3, day 4. So they actually cash in on people's actual experience of time because lockdown made time feel so slow for many people, with very little social interaction, and people basically just looking out the window hoping that the day would end, which studies specifically with the elderly has shown that the experience of time slowed down during lockdowns for elderly people. And this is exactly what these novels do. They make you narratively re-experience, or not but rather experience what you are experiencing at the moment of reading.
There's actually a question in the chat about reading experience. How and in what ways do you feel lockdown has changed the experience of reading, and have these experiences been sustained? So this is, of course, it's ironized in one sense because of reading about the experience that you're having, which has then been fictionalized. So yeah, how do you respond to that question about reading, the nature of intensification of reading in lockdown?
Yeah, I think that the novel is so well attuned to this experience, because reading the novel ever since the 18th century has been assessed as an experience where you isolate yourself necessarily, because you draw back into yourself, but in which you also open yourself up to the fictional world that is being created, which is very often huge. I mean, if you think about 19th century novels with tons of characters, those typical Victorian 3-decker novels, they create a huge world in which you can immerse yourself, but you can only properly immerse yourself if you isolate yourself from the real people surrounding you, which is the idealized experience of reading a novel. It's very long. You do it on your own. We very rarely these days read novels out loud, except for our kids probably, and I wouldn't read these to my kids actually. So it's the novel always already in its narrative form combines that sense of sharing a world, but in isolation. And I think this is why the novel has been so conducive to narratively catching lockdown, because this is what the novel has always done. It creates a whole world, but you can be alone with that world while reading.
Yeah, very interesting. Diane, I have lots of questions I wanted to ask you as well. This is a thing that you didn't touch on, but I was just thinking about the kind of, the customer experience, and it's more the notices that, and they could happen online, but I associate them more with a kind of interpersonal encounter in which there's a warning that abusive behavior will not be tolerated.
Yeah. Assaults on staff will not be tolerated.
Yeah. And which is always, it's kind of sad. Like, okay, apparently this happens sufficiently frequently that you have to issue this warning.
Yeah.
But I mean, is that part of your story when you're talking about this kind of social change in effect, which has been, ongoing, shall we say?
Yeah, well, I mean, those kinds of notices really originated in airports, didn't they? And they've been around in
Mm.
airports for a long time. And the fact that they've now proliferated beyond the space of the airport is to some extent, for me anyway, indicative that the airport is everything now in different ways. What I mean by that is we can read a lot of different social and economic and class fracture points through
Right.
the airport. But yeah, I mean, I think, you know, there's partly a kind of a heightened discourse for frontline staff of their own endangerment, of
Mhm.
their own imperilment by customers, not by their employers, right? So this is partly why I think of sweeping. But yeah, so it kind of really what it does, I think, is doubles down, and I hope you can hear me because the internet connection is poor. You know, on this kind of this constant friction between a frontline worker and a customer. And so I think that kind of sense that assaults will not be tolerated. Well, who's speaking that? You know, it's a very interesting, you know,
Yeah.
kind of mystification of where that's coming from, under whose authority. But the one thing I would add to what you said on that, Dan, is also that I think to some extent that sense, that warning to customers or clients or passengers or whomever that assaults will not be tolerated is now joined by the smiley face button, right? So when you go through the airport and lots of other sites as well, you now get the opportunity, you know, as a customer to evaluate the performance of staff. And, you know, that feels like a sop to us, like, well, how do you know, because a lot of what I think is going on in neoliberal customer culture is that we are constantly being invited for our feedback. You know, that feedback may be weaponized against staff in all kinds of ways. It may never be judged at all, but it gives us a feeling that we are being consulted. And
Yeah. No, that's that is an interesting point. And of course, there are only three possible reactions.
right. Exactly. So, you know, it's
So,
always datafied. So it isn't as if, I mean, these kinds of feedback, you know, these days you don't stay in a good hotel without immediately getting an invitation for your feedback. You don't, you know, so many of the experiences we have, we are immediately being asked to evaluate them. So I think this is a big part of the customer service culture we're now in.
yeah. Actually, I was going to pick up on a point you were making about cash and the discouragement of cash transactions. And
Yeah.
probably like most people, well, I find it in relation to tipping and so forth, I don't have loose change on me anymore. Well, all right, there's been some remedies that have come up with that, but it's just the movement to the card. Well, that means that all transactions can be tracked and
Yes.
analyzed.
Yes.
It just reminded me of somebody saying to me some years ago, I like the anonymity of cash. And I never thought of it in those terms, but I think it's becoming more apparent that, well, if that may or may not be your motivation, but nonetheless, there's something else going on, something else that's being enabled by the movement to something which may decrease the likelihood of infection. So interesting aspect of it. Yeah, I was wondering if you could comment a little bit on yeah.
You hear me now?
I can do. Yeah.
Okay, sorry, go ahead, Dan.
Yeah, just about aspects of how advertising and the experience that is offered to you through advertising, particularly I suppose in relation to technology or maybe the consumer or customer relationship in particular. Have you noticed any, I don't know, any trends in the forms of representation in that kind of domain that are part of your story, so to speak?
In terms of how the customer is represented in, let's say, popular culture, advertising, that sort of thing?
Yeah, that kind of thing. I mean, I'm just sort of interested, certainly in the way that technology is offered. It's always as a social experience, particularly around Christmas, when, you know, the big time for big sales of, but it's always, hey, everyone gather around. I associate it particularly with VR. So you're supposed to look at somebody having a VR experience, which is tremendously entertaining to watch them, which I doubt. Secondly, maybe once. And then after that, it's not very interesting to watch somebody having an experience which is closed off by definition.
Yeah.
So anyway, I don't know if there was anything, the aspect of the way the advertising is working to sell us on the concept in some sense. Yeah.
On that in all kinds of ways. But I think one key shift, which has been intensified by the pandemic, is the idea that you are in company when you are with your smartphone. and that you move through the whole city with your smartphone, sort of paving the way, navigating for your credit card, of course, is the second really key accoutrement of moving through public space. But with QR codes and things like that, I think that there is this kind of sense that the phone opens up all manner of kind of experiences for you. And it's just, again, that kind of frictionless, seamless experience that is increasingly being fantasized about in popular culture, that you don't have to interact with anyone at all. And I think, you know, one of the things that's really interesting I've started to notice this spring is how many people in various kinds of settings, restaurants, etc., are by themselves with their phone. And this is what I think there's been a kind of a relaxing of prohibitions. There used to be quite a stigma, particularly for women, to be out on their own in various domains, right? Especially restaurants and places like that. I see a kind of relaxation of that. When someone is with their phone, they are in company, and it's not as if they are truly alone, right? So I think that shift is one that I've really noticed as we've gotten.
Yeah, that's very well observed. Yeah, I think I know exactly what you mean. I'm obviously also see people, you know, it might be couples or families where everyone has their phone. So they've also, you sort of think, gosh, you know, the communication patterns there are interesting. But no, I think you're absolutely right about the, you know, the single individual was, as you say, stigmatized, but is now, no, they're still with the world. They're having a social experience. It's not something where you pity them. In fact, they might be having a better time.
Yeah, exactly. It's a
and if they were trying to chat to somebody in which we're maybe losing some of our accomplishments in that area. So
could I add a short comment here? It's what I find so weird about this is that, you know, during lockdown, everybody was saying that they were pining for social contact. Now that social contact is more and more possible, and people even talk about the new normal, whatever that may be, you see that people do not seem to be that fond of it anyway, you know, because if their smartphone is the most fun person to be with, they could be with their smartphone all during lockdown. You know, there are these strange ambivalences within, you know, calls for relaxing lockdown, calls for relaxing masks. We don't need these masks. It keeps people from interacting and really being with each other because the face is so important. Blah blah blah. But then, after all, you're encouraged to, now that we can actually be outside and, you know, eat out at restaurants, to not actually talk to each other now that we can. So I mean, there is this strange ambivalence of what people said they wanted and now can have, but don't seem to be so very keen about.
Yeah, no, that's very well put. This question coming for you, Diana, and in fact, this was kind of what you were talking about as a whole, but just asking whether you could say more on whether or how COVID has introduced new or amplified pre-existing aspects of the interface between companies and customers. I guess that is kind of the key question. I mean, I don't know how you express this, but, you know, was this something that was bound to happen, or is it you did say it's an acceleration? So I don't know if you can comment further on that.
By corporations, that they are using, you know, COVID essentially as leverage for, if that makes sense. And
right.
And I think, but one of the things that strikes me just lately, and I've seen it in New York as well as in Dublin, is, you know, in terms of this withdrawal of service by corporations in ways that in previous eras, let's say 10 years ago, even would have been unimaginable. So empty spaces, right, where there are you know, no staff. There's nobody in the bank. I was in a bank here in New York actually yesterday, a rather large space, and there was no one there. The door was open, but there was no one there. And, you know, I think this kind of sense that the physical, you know, what's sometimes called brick and mortar, right? There's a big discourse in the US at the moment about the fate of the shopping mall, right? And the rapid decline of it as what was, you know, for a long time, a pretty normative social institution. But I think going back to Sarah's point, which I found really interesting, at the heart of a lot of these developments is a devaluation of the social, is a sense that strangers are scary, is a sense that everyday social contact isn't meaningful or desirable. And again, the smartphone. by more closely bonding to our digital technologies and devices, it sort of is a very natural development that the social just sort of drops away in many respects. And as we know, of course, digital sociality is highly tribal, right? It's generally not, although people thought so at the start of the sort of digital age, it was going to be this great portal to meeting people and all. But in fact, it gathers people who are already known to one another, right? And people who are like one another. And so I'm very concerned with the broader implications of this in terms of how our social knownness is being taken over by digital kind of definitions of friendship groups and followers.
Yeah, thank you. That's, I must say, very helpful in thinking about that. There's a further question. Maybe I might direct this to Sarah in the first instance in the chat. COVID lockdowns and now routine remote working and socializing have redefined the concept of downsizing for older people, a threat from the wider society. You are sitting in a house that is too big for you. Can the panel comment on this? I suppose it's kind of COVID related in one sense. I don't know if you have any observations on that, that kind of logic of downsizing in a sense.
Yeah, I think it very nicely ties into what Diane has talked about when it comes to downsizing customer interaction and cutting staff. What is happening at my home university at the moment is that the rectorate is implementing a permanent policy for working from home, which seems nice at the first glance, but which is because now we can, pandemic or not, always work from home for 10 days a month, each month, and that's perfectly fine. But what it means is that we will have desk sharing in the future. That people will not have their own offices anymore and will not even have shared offices anymore with their own desk, but that what the rectorate basically wants to implement is a kind of hot desk policy. And I think the same happens with private spaces as well. And that sense of downsizing in terms of who didn't lockdown show you that this house is far too big and you felt so lonely. And the sense of who is taking up how much space and can they afford it. This is something that is always interesting when it comes to home, because home is also a built structure. It's a built form, and that built form always shows you who is allowed to take up how much space in a culture, in a cramped city space. How large are the apartments? How many people are living in these apartments? And in other areas of the city, how much people are living in less than half of that? So basically, who can afford to take up how much space? And the lockdown basically allowed many public institutions to interfere with that. Schools to tell parents how much space does your kid need. The prime minister saying, please stay at home, but only with these and these people, and don't do this, and this, and this. So the necessary things that we were allowed to do during lockdown, and with whom, and where, and how long, and until which hour in the evening. So you can see, all this impact the sense of who is allowed to take how much space, and downsizing will definitely, in the workplace, it will definitely come.
Can I come in on that as well? Because I think this is a fascinating area of discussion. We're all living with it as faculty members in universities. I think that the faculty office, as we've known it, is a distinct threat to the neoliberal university. And I think that one of the threats it represents is of a faculty member who is too at home at work. To go back to some of your points, Sarah, I think this has been very clear, in Belfield for quite a number of years, certainly well before the pandemic. And part of this, just to add to what Sarah's already said, which I think is eloquent, is that kind of destabilized effect is then very much picked up on in the kind of the shared workspace as a model in the broader world beyond academia, the WeWork, this kind of thing, right? That everybody is portable, everybody's expendable, and the traditional model of a faculty member, who had so many of their own things in their office, where, as I've talked about this before in other contexts, the faculty office is a showcase of who you are and your own sort of professional identity. And it's I think.
Yeah. Very interesting. Yeah, we lost you there just for a second at the end,
Oh,
but
I'm
you
sorry.
had made your point. No,
I
that's
hope
very
so.
resonant. And it's also, yeah, it is, part of the identity of the academic was certainly the privilege of having an extraordinarily messy office, which, with mild apology, but it wasn't so beyond the norm or the unacceptable levels of messiness. But these are fully inhabited spaces. There's no question about that. And I suppose part of their function was that nobody else can inhabit them, because you couldn't do that to a colleague reasonably.
Yeah.
Coming towards the end of our time, there are a couple of other things that have come through, and I did want to acknowledge those questions. Carol Cook is saying, thank you, Sarah, for naming what I'm experiencing in post-lockdown Canada, ambivalence about being social and meeting live and in person with friends and neighbors again. Does anyone care to comment further about your experience with this in Dublin or New York City, or indeed Galway? So yeah, I think to a certain extent you have. I don't know if you wanted to remark on that further. Do you think that there is, I mean, presumably there'll be some cultural variation there. There's some differences across Europe, for example, or internationally in that experience and the degree to which people can re-inhabit those spaces, sometimes depending upon whether spaces that are interior are ones that you begin to share again, as opposed to exterior spaces, which are more safe from a public health point of view. But it partly depends a little bit on weather and factors of that kind. Yeah, I don't know if either of you see any trends there in terms of how people occupy those spaces.
I think definitely, definitely people are, all over the world are becoming less comfortable with inviting strangers into their private spaces. Or with, I have seen this in the Austrian context when it comes to kids' birthday parties. They just didn't happen, and they don't happen now.
Right. Yeah.
People basically postpone these things. Any big family event that you would have had. I mean, there are definitely cultural differences here, with some cultures even during lockdown, being more open towards family congregations, and very different definitions of what family is in the first place. And there's also a generational difference. I mean, young people were often kind of presented as driving the pandemic because they refused to not congregate, and they refused not to party, and they refused not to meet and have drinks, and then they just removed themselves from obviously public spaces. For example, in Vienna, they took to the vineyards. They did their parties and drinking there because the police wouldn't see it. We could hear it, but the police wouldn't see it. So, I mean, there are definitely differences here, and it's, it will be interesting to see how this pans out.
Yeah, it's interesting you mentioned that, because certainly I'm experienced, for example, on the campus at NUIG Galway, the students would congregate, and then security would get wind of it, and there might be a neighbor or somebody complaining, and then they would disperse. But then, because everybody is connected through their phones, they just say, well, let's meet elsewhere, at point action, and they reconvene. So it was somewhat futile exercise in chasing people from one spot to another. Maybe we'll just come to one final thing in closing. There's a further question or comment in the chat. The social aspect, this is Alan Menez is saying, the social aspect has been devalued, and we're moving away from it willingly or not after the confinement and all the home delivery services that offered a new vision of daily life. Perhaps, Diane, for you to kind of comment on home delivery as another aspect.
I'm fascinated by home delivery. You might not be surprised to hear. I'm sorry, there's background noise now in addition to the other tech problems. My apologies. I'm in a highly unsecured environment, as you can see. But I am really interested in, again, it's another kind of interface or portal, but in the front door space as the delivery kind of zone. And when you think back to the very beginning of the pandemic, and people were like rinsing off their deliveries and disinfecting them and leaving them outside for several days. Yes, but I think that sense of anybody could be right at your doorstep carries a kind of a threat now. And one of the ways in which this threat has been technologically managed, particularly in the US, is through the doorbell camera, right? The Amazon offers one. I think it's the most prevalent. But the idea that you are always kind of, and this really goes back to some of Sarah's points, and I hope some of my own as well. And this into that traditionally safe space just doesn't work in the same way.
Yeah, no, it is actually, it is. You're quite right. It actually is a lovely point of contact between your two papers. So maybe that's a good note on which to end. I just really wanted to thank you both very much for a really fascinating discussion, and it's just really alerted me to so many things and organized, just speaking for myself, of ways of encountering this experience, which part of which has been shifting in its meaning and significance over time. So it's been really terrific to hear your talk. I wish, really looking forward to seeing how your projects develop. And so thank you again to colleagues in the Royal Irish Academy for helping out and hosting the event. And thank you, everybody, for joining us today. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Dan. Thanks, everyone.